This email provokes a bit of discussion, I believe, on the classic wrestling. It's from Michael. Apparently, because of his email address, he lives in Nashville. Jim. Well, and you, Brian.
Whatever.
Yeah, I have a question. I had heard if you became NWA World Champion, you had to put up a $25,000 deposit for the title belt in case something happened to it. In parentheses, fire, lose it, it gets damaged, etc. What about the other belts like the tag team titles, U.S. title, North American title, etc.? Were you required to put up such a deposit to get the belt and cover it in case something happened, or were you just given the title? What were the different promotions' rules and policies toward care and possession of the titles? And what was Jarrett's, Watts, Fritz, Von Erich's, and Crockett's rules and policies toward you having the various title belts in your possession? And what would happen, say you lost a belt like the airlines losing it or some other reason? And do you know of any situation of any champion losing or having his championship belt damaged? There's a lot in there. And again, we laugh at some of the questions because it's so hard to explain, because it's actually in some cases inexplicable how things worked in the territory days and etc. But let's cover the NWA title belt first. As it has been mentioned in the fine book by Tim Hornbaker on the National Wrestling Alliance, as well as the Buddy Rogers biography he also wrote, and this story is out, that when you were chosen to become the NWA World Champion, you were required to put up a deposit with the National Wrestling Alliance office against the belt, but it wasn't the belt per se, it was the title, it was the championship. It was the idea that when your time has come and your run as champion is over, you will do a job to someone that we pick to pass the title belt to them. So you weren't really putting a deposit. The belt was symbolic, as we've talked about. The title is different than a belt. The belt is the symbolic of the title or championship that you hold. But what they were worried about, the NWA in those days, was pushing a guy as the world champion of their organization, which covered most of the country and different places around the world, and him being presented, which at the time he was, especially before the AWA or the WWF, as the greatest wrestler in the world, that somebody at some point might decide they didn't want to fucking lose that. They didn't want to lose a match. When there was time for somebody else to take over because of business, the promoters had voted, whatever the case, that is sort of like maybe, now that I'm thinking about this, they ought to make the President of the United States put up a hell of a deposit. Said next election, if you lose, get the hell out of Dodge or you forfeit your fucking bond. But anyway, so it was the idea of making them lose the belt, but more importantly, making them lose the championship, passing the number one position on to another wrestler. That's what the NWA World Champions deposit was. Have I uttered that somewhat correctly, Brian, to where people may now understand what the deal was with that? It wasn't just about the belt. It was about the idea of you're the champion.
Yes, I think you've explained it pretty well there. But again, the question was about beyond the NWA World title belt, the other belts.
Well, and hold on a second here, because there's also, he mentioned a $25,000 deposit. That was what Flair put up. Because and I'm not sure what his original deposit was in 1981, but in 1986, when Crockett got the big gold belt made that replaced the domed globe, it actually legitimately cost, God damn it, it's been 35 years, but what did I say? It was almost 30 grand then, right? The cost of the belt. And so he put up the $25,000 deposit that was the figure at that time, and that was never returned because when Crockett sold to Turner and everybody was still together, it just wasn't thought of, and the NWA was a separate entity, but really WCW was kind of it, and then they got sideways with the NWA, and then point is, when Flair took the belt to the WWF in what, 1991? Was it 2?
1991, summer of 91.
Summer of 91. That great Bryan Adams song. The legal standing that he had and claimed, and the reason why it was in dispute, was because since his deposit had never been returned, he claimed ownership of the belt. And the court finally decided, correct me if I'm wrong, that he had to get his money back, Flair did, but that he had to return the belt. Is that pretty much the way it happened?
I believe so.
So that was $25,000 in 1986. That equals today $65,000. But that was, and I'm not, to be quite honest, Jim Crockett paid certain other things for Flair over the period of time that he worked there. I'm not sure that maybe Crockett might not have put up any deposit that Flair had to put up for the first time he won the title, the first belt in 81.
Well, he sponsored Flair to be the champion, didn't he?
Yeah.
So I'm sure I would put money. Actually, you're probably right. He probably did put money up for Flair.
Well, and remember the same thing happened, did it not, with Lou Thesz and Sam Muchnick in 1963 when Thesz was semi-retired and Muchnick asked him to come back to work full-time and take the belt from Buddy Rogers because of the problems with Rogers being booked by Vince Sr. and the NWA promoters getting frozen out on a lot of dates. Thesz said, hey, you're calling me and asking me to come and do this because, I'm the only one that can if he don't want to. So Muchnick, I believe, put up Thesz's deposit in that instance. And remember, there was also a situation where to get the champion's booking fee and the NWA's percentages and everything from Rogers out of Vince Sr., did not Muchnick have to threaten Vince and or Buddy Rogers with, hey, your bond is going to charity unless all these and to get the belt off of him also when he'd been injured and didn't want to do the job and blah, 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 so that everything came together.
Tim Hornbaker has a lot of those papers, actually.
Yeah, but they held Rogers' $10,000 deposit at the time. This was 1963, or he put it up in 61 when he won it. $10,000 today equals $96,000. And honestly, I'm not surprised that that would be worth more money than the bond was in 1986, because still in those days, and I believe the bond in some cases, especially earlier back in the Gold Dust Trio days and the days of the Fall Guys, whatever arrangements were made, it was for a lot more money because double crosses were prevalent. There was a chance as a guy could go to a rival promoter and take the reputation of being the world champion with him. So the value of the world championship in wrestling was at its height, actually, in relative to, society in every other way back in the 30s when the Strangler Lewises and the Jim Londoses and the people that were figured in were doing ballpark crowds and getting, half of the gate for being there. And it went downhill as more champions proliferated, as, the whole business became more fragmented. And also the question was, what happened if a fire? That's never happened. And I got news for you. The NWA world champion, if there'd been a fire, he'd have run out of his hotel room naked, but carrying the belt if he had to. That'd cover just about anybody. There have been a few belts. Remember Bruno Sammartino when he had the WWF belt, the original one that they got him made after he won Johnny Barron's U.S. title from Buddy Rogers in the Garden. And then they got an actual belt made for their company. It was 1965 or so. After a garden show, he went to eat in New York at an Italian restaurant, and the belt was in his bag in the car, in the trunk or wherever. And when he came out, it was broken into and his bag was stolen. That made the news of what 7 years later, Pedro Morales do you know the story of exactly what fucking brought him to think that pawning the WWF Championship belt in a pawn shop in the Northeast was a good idea?
Well, Tom Burke was the one who discovered it and purchased it, and he told me when I asked him that question that he was told that, I think the exact quote was, Petey loved the horses. And that maybe Pedro spent a little bit or lost a little too much gambling, and that caused the pawning of the World Championship belt.
The World Tag Team titles for Crockett, we've talked about Rick Rude and Manny Fernandez. When they left, they took those with them. But Crockett had those tag team belts since the mid-'70s. Nikita Molkovich made them, the guy who made a lot of the belts before Reggie Parks. With the territory belts, you didn't have to put up a deposit because you were working your full-time job in that territory. And if they had enough faith in you to put the belt on you, then they had enough faith in you to carry it around. Sometimes that came back to bite a promoter in the ass. There's been numerous stories over the dozens of territories and dozens of decades of guys getting mad at the promoter or the booker because they felt they got screwed on money, took off without dropping the belt. But again, the investment in the actual belt in those days was negligible. When I got the Smoky Mountains belts made from Reggie Parks in 1992, they were like $1,500 a piece. So 20 years beforehand, if you gave a good belt maker $500, $750, and then still we've talked about how cheap some of the territories were. Jerry Jarrett wouldn't spend a fucking dime on a title belt. They used that Southern Junior Heavyweight title belt from 1952 when the tournament happened and retired it in 1976. And, every once in a while, when champions, even regional champions, the NWA champion would never check the belt on an airplane. Flair came on the plane with one thing in each hand, a brush for his hair in one hand. And
I'm afraid of what's in the other one. Don't say it.
No, the Halliburton with the fucking belt in the other one. And I just got that now. Thank you. But that's what it was, is you took the belt with you. And when the Midnight Express were champions for any company, World Class or Crockett or Mid-South, I carried the belts on my carry-on bag. If that counted in the car, through airports, had them with me, whatever the fuck. Not all managers did that, but we never checked them or left them out of our sight, or except if they were in the locker room. But, talk about damage, there was not a deposit on any of the belts for damage, because we talked Kerry Von Erich, when he won the NWA belt, the Dome Globe at Texas Stadium, he carved his initials in it. There's pictures Dick Bourne and those guys in Greensboro did the book on the belts, and there's close-up pictures of his KVR. Or KVE, rather. KVR. What the Kerry Von Rick. KVE.
People said he was messed up, and one of the first signs was when he carved in the wrong initials on the NWA belt.
Anybody seen my dog? Anyway, so, and then you had something you said earlier. What the fuck was it?
Oh, on Mid-South TV, they once had a close-up of the North American belt, not the big one. When I say big, the gigantic one that was made in 84, but the old one that had been around for years.
Like Waldo Von Erich and Bill Watts had worn it, etc.
It went from McGurk to Mid-South Wrestling, and everyone, the Junkyard Dog, DiBiase, everyone had held it. Someone at some point carved the word stooge into it.
Saying that probably wasn't the holder of that championship at the time. It was probably a commentary from somebody else in the locker room on whoever held. But, but they're not going to change the belt for that. They're just, nobody will see it.
That's a ballsy move, though, because you're not just doing it to the wrestler who is at least accused of being the stooge. You're doing it to the office when you damage the belt, right?
Well, I don't know if they did it out in the middle of the ring in front of God and everybody on videotape. There's been no story about that. Maybe it was very surreptitious.
I'm surprised there isn't a Watts memo, like, tension. Do not carve anything into the belts.
But again, here we've talked about this before. We're putting all these things in one little clip here where everybody can digest it. But You know, it was, yes, it was on the honor system and responsibility. And you didn't, in a territory, you didn't want to fuck up and lose their belt. You might lose your job. You might get fired, or they'd fucking take it out of your fucking pay or whatever. When you were the world champion, the belt was very precious to you because it was the thing that symbolized that you were the number one talent in the business and one of the 1 or 2 or 3 most highly paid guys, depending on the era, whether it was around with Andre or Gorgeous George, whatever the fuck. But at the same time, the world title meant more. The territories, if somebody walked out without, dropping the belt to somebody, imagine this, the title changed hands last week in Bluefield, West Virginia. We don't have any tape, but here's the new champion. And
here are the Road Warriors.
Yeah, and here are the and sometimes a guy would leave, but he would return the belt because he didn't. That's another thing. You can get sideways with, Bob Geigel in Kansas City, and Don Owens in Portland may not have given a shit, but if you took Bob Geigel's belt, Don Owens, when you get to Portland for a new job, may not be happy because you've just stolen another promoter's belt. So there was that kind of thing. So
yeah, you're allowed to steal a promoter's plane, but not his belt.
Well, and that's only if you're Sam Mineker, and then he was a silver-tongued devil. But that, they could switch the title in a phantom match in the territories and it wouldn't create much stir. But for the world champion, you needed the lineage, you needed tape, you needed pictures, you needed proof. It was a big deal. So that's where the various deposits came in. And then, of course, I don't think they did that in the other companies, because in the AWA, it was either Verne or somebody that was not only working for him, but one of his mainstays, Mad Dog Vachon, the Crusher, Bockwinkel. With Vince Sr., he put the thing on Bruno, and my God, Bruno was more important than the championship. So that was the least thing on his mind, I'm assuming, was Bruno going to take off with my title? And then they just never created the precedent for it.